Thanks for joining me. Have you got poor performers on your team? Maybe only one in your organization or in your enterprise? Well, today, let's talk about how they cost you a lot more than you might think. Leadership is hard, but sometimes we make it a lot harder than it needs to be by not addressing poor performance when it shows up on our teams. Let's talk about the hidden and very high cost of poor performers. Here is how that cost is hidden. When you have a poor performer on your team or in your enterprise, we tend to work around them because they don't perform poorly instantly and for long periods of time. They slowly drift into it. So we find out ways to start working around the poor performer. It takes longer, it takes more effort to do it, and so that's our first hidden cost. The second hidden cost, which is really a powerful one to pay attention to, is your top performers are going to pull back just a little bit. They will start getting a little bit bored because they can't spread their wings. They can't perform at a very high level. They're dragging that rock around behind them of that poor performer on your team, and eventually your top performers will leave. The highest performing people have the most opportunities, and so if they're surrounded by poor performers, or if there's one over in the corner that's not being dealt with, they'll start looking around. Another cost that's a hidden cost is that communication, which is always a challenge in an organization. Whether your organization is one where everyone sits around a table all day long, or people are spread out across time zones or anything in between, communication is always a challenge. But when you have a poor performer on your team, communication slows down. One of the main reasons is that we find that people spend a lot of time talking about the poor performer instead of talking about whatever else they could be doing. So instead of spending an hour communicating about what should be communicated, they spend a half an hour talking about the poor performer and a half an hour talking about the poor performer, right? It's a hidden cost. Communication slows down. Creativity and innovation are stifled because the energy level that people need to be creative and take risk is actually now muted. Also, another amazing thing that happens is what I like to call a shadow organization. Shadow organization begins to develop. It's one of the high costs of allowing poor performers to just hang around on your team or in your organizations in an unaddressed way. A shadow organization is that you think the organization is like this and everyone talks about it like it's like this, but because of the poor performer and because you as a leader are not managing that situation, the organization is actually like this. This is how it really works. We say we're a really good, highly effective team. We're very efficient and effective. We know what we're doing, but in fact, we really don't. We're working around these people over here. So that's called a shadow organization. How does it really work around here? Especially when you walk out of the room, that's called a shadow organization. Another high cost, very high cost, is what we call the lowest common denominator effect. That means that in most teams, unless they are a high-performing team, a high-performance team has specific kind of elements to it. But in most teams, if you have a poor performer in some area, that the team will eventually all drift down to that level of performance. Might take a few weeks, might take a few months, but we'll all act like that person acts. So that's called the lowest common denominator effect. And it is incredibly expensive. You know, can I get personal? There's another hidden and high cost if you do not address poor performance on your team. Your credibility suffers. Folks see the poor performer, they look at each other, they look at you, they look at the poor performer, they look at each other, they look back at you, and they think, do you not understand what's going on? Do you not get it? Are you clueless? Your credibility begins to suffer. There are more costs, but that's convincing enough for you to realize that if you allow poor performance to continue unaddressed for a long period of time, there are so many hidden costs that are very difficult to overcome. Well, why don't you address it? If you're aware of the poor performance, why don't you address it? And as I've talked with lots of leaders over the years, why have they not decided to step up and address that poor performance? Well, it starts with a few things that they have as assumptions, a few things they believe are true. Some of them might actually feel, hopefully you don't feel this way, that work is a burden, or work is a curse, or work is bad. Instead of seeing meaningful work that is creative and good and impactful as a blessing, they think of work as a curse. It's bad. So they don't want to put any more bad on people. And it's really an amazing and kind of an insipid mental model. Here's another one of the assumptions or mental models you may have, or maybe not you, maybe a friend of yours may have. about why you do not, or that's keeping you from actually addressing poor performance, you might say, oh, I just don't have time. I know it's going to take a lot of time. I'm busy. I'll get to it later. You know, that phrase, I don't have time, has always bothered me. In reality, what you should be saying is, I didn't want to take the time. Because you and I have exactly the same number of hours in every day. It's not like there's some sort of massive curve of physics that happens where I get 28 hours and you get 16. No, it's the same number of hours that we've got. Now, we do have different levels of responsibility, but if I ever say I don't have time for that, really what I'm saying is I didn't want to take the time for that. Another one of the assumptions that I've got that keeps me from, or might keep you if you have this assumption, from addressing poor performance is I don't want to make that person unhappy. I don't want to stress them out because I think stress is bad. Stress is not bad if it's resolved. If we are moving through stress to a productive outcome, to a better place, stress is good for us. That's the upside of stress. It's that unresolved stuff where we can't find a lever to pull. We can't figure out what to do with it. And it's just a threat response on our part. That's the stuff that's bad. So when you address poor performance, it's not bad. It's stressful in the moment. It might be pressure on that person for a week while they figure out how to turn their performance around or figure out how to go somewhere else. Or a month or 6 months. It might be stressful for them, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It can actually be good. Think of all those times in your life when you were under a lot of pressure and you made it through that pressure really well and you're better off for it on the other side of it. Stress is not bad. That kind of stress, that kind of pressure, it's good. Here's another mental model you may have that might keep you from actually dealing with a poor performer. Maybe they're really, really good in one area, one small area. They are like savants. They are so good. And you keep justifying that in all the other 11 or 12 areas of their job responsibilities, they're not good at all, but they're good in that one area, and you're hoping that it'll kind of balance out. Well, it actually doesn't. Now here's another one. They are occasionally really good at their entire job. When the winds of weirdness blow just right, when they're just caffeinated enough, or when they have just the right amount of bourbon and their blood alcohol level is just right, they perform at an incredibly high level. But those times are fewer and further between in occurrence, and therefore they're really not all that good at their job. You might also think, probably from experience, because you've worked with your team for quite a while, that if that person performs poorly, it's okay, the others will step in. Because they have. They have stepped in over and over and over. They've done not only their work, but that poor performer's work as well. They start carrying the load. And it's okay for a brief period of time if somebody is not doing well and they need help. That is very appropriate. But if it goes on for very long, you're actually dragging down the others. And then all the else hidden costs kick into gear as well. Maybe you think, well, I don't want to mess with this. I'm just going to do it myself. Maybe you think, they're so fun. I love their personality. They bring cookies. Maybe you think all those things. That's why you don't want to address people who are poor performing. And let me get personal again, because you know, it's just you and me here. No one's looking over your shoulder. You're probably not watching this in a group. Maybe the reason you're not addressing that poor performer is you're just lazy. Could it be? Nah, that's not you. That's not you. That's somebody else you know. All right, so you decide, all right, I get it. I got to address poor performer. Avoid these 7 mistakes when you address poor performers. Number 1, you don't have any written expectations. So that's a mistake. If you've never written out your expectations, how can you have a conversation with her as a poor performer? The second mistake you want to make sure you don't make is that we just don't pay attention. We're so busy doing our thing over here that we're not actually paying attention. Don't make that mistake. You need to pay attention, because when you address poor performer, they're going to say, give me an example. They're going to say, give me 12 examples. And you should be able to have those examples. Maybe 2 or 3, not 12. Here's the 4th mistake. That is, our past performance becomes kind of an excuse. Well, you know, I didn't pull my weight last month. I didn't pull my weight last year. When I was in that job, I wasn't all that good at it. So then you justify, you make it an excuse that because you are not doing the best you can, that you can't address the performance on that other person's part. Well, you know what to do with that. If the issue comes up about your poor performance in the past, when you're addressing the performance of the individual in question, and they say, well, you used to do it, you know what to do with that. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was wrong. It was wrong then, and I'm not going to do that again. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about you, right? Also, if it's current right now, if you're being lazy, or if you're being distracted, or you're not really bringing your A game every time you come to work and support that team, then you need to step up. And if they say to you, yeah, well, you're kind of lazy too, you could say, you're right, I'm sorry, I'm changing that right now. Let's change this together, okay? Here's the fifth mistake that sometimes we make, and you want to avoid this mistake. You rely on your memory about that person's performance rather than on notes or documentation. This is a pretty big deal. So take notes, write it down. On this day, this happened. On this day, this didn't happen. And you don't need a whole thick notebook full of that. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's important to be able to not rely on your memory. Because you know how memory works. Memory is built around a concept called salience. The most memorable stuff we have is stuff that we felt and saw and heard and tasted. It's salient. It's so memorable, but it's probably not accurate. Our memory really needs to be prompted by notes, not just by what's the most salient stuff that comes to mind, all right? Also, here's another mistake we make. Here's a sixth one out of 7 mistakes. We triangulate. That is, instead of talking with the poor performer about her performance, we talk with someone else about her poor performance. That's called triangulation. There's a video we've got here in our collection of videos about that. Triangulation is destructive. You want to communicate directly with somebody instead of about them. One of the many problems, actually, of triangulation is it makes me feel better when I do it. I feel like I've somehow been productive, that I've solved the problem, when all I did was vent. All I did was talk about the problem, and talking about the problem and addressing the problem are not the same thing. And it is profoundly disrespectful to triangulate. But you know that, right? And here we go, the 7th mistake you want to make sure that you avoid is you're extremely unclear about the results that you want that person to achieve. Poor performers often think they are performing well because they're doing a bunch of tasks, when in fact you want them to understand that they are responsible for achieving with other people some results. So, all right, now that you're not going to make those 7 mistakes, now it's time for you to address the poor performance of the individual on your team. How do you do this? Here we go. I'm going to say it quickly because it's a video. You can back up and watch it again, all right? There are 5 things that you need to do. Number 1, get curious. You're missing something. So enter the entire process with that, with the understanding that I'm missing something. And it might just be a little thing that will change your perspective or your timing a little bit, or it might be a great big thing that will change your entire approach. So get curious. Understand you're missing something. That's a big, big deal, all right? And it takes humility to be able to do that. Here's the second thing. Clarify your expectations. Just because you carry the expectations around in your head doesn't mean that she understands what you expect or he understands what you expect. Maybe you had expectations that were written 3 years ago, but you haven't actually clarified them since then. Make sure they're clear, make sure they're written down, make sure they're behavioral, and make sure your expectations are result-oriented. That will solve almost every one of your performance problems when you do that. Here's the third thing you need to do. Ask the question, and you'll do so when you engage with him or with her, is he or she coachable? In other words, do they want to actually learn how to be better at what they're doing? Have they been frustrated with it themselves? Are they open to learning new ways? Are they curious themselves? Do they have an appetite to learn? If they are not coachable, if in fact they sit back and fold their arms and say, it's all you, it's all you, it's all you, or it's all the system, or it's all those people, or gravity is turned up and all that sort of thing, if that's what they do, they're not coachable. That means you're going to take them down a discipline track, not a coaching track. And as you know, a coaching track, if you're the coach is responsible for about 20% of the lifting, and 80% of it needs to come from the person being coached. If a person is uncoachable, they have the skill, but they're choosing to not use it, then you're going to take them down a discipline track. And the discipline track, 100% of the responsibility for that person turning around their performance is on them. 0% of it is on you. All you need to do is say, this is the change we need to see. We need to see it done immediately, and we need to see it sustained. If you do that, you're going to be back on track. All right? So here's the 4th thing that you want to make sure that you do, or in this case, don't do. Don't wait for big patterns to develop. One of the biggest mistakes that we make is that we take, like I said earlier, we take notes, we write down everything, but then we do it for weeks or months or years before we actually address the poor performance. Don't do that. Take notes, write it down, document, but just take notes for yourself, but make sure that you keep a short list. How disrespectful is it for you to come to a person and say, hey, we have a performance problem? They say, really? How long has it been going on? And you say 9 months. I mean, come on, that's so unbelievably disrespectful. They can't change it. It's now a habit. It's a whole set of disciplines and habits that are in place that have probably been rewarded tacitly or not. And so now you're wanting them to change, and they're not going to be able to trust you after the effect either. So they're going to say at the end of that conversation, well, is there anything else that you're frustrated about? Oh, no, I'm not frustrated about anything else. They're going to think, yeah, right. You kept this to yourself for 9 or 10 months. Why would you be honest with me now? Oh, it's destructive. So that's the point. Don't keep long patterns. Don't look for patterns before you step up and address performance problems. Okay? Here's the 5th thing you need to do, and that is when you're talking with that person about her performance, talk about behavior. Do not talk about internal psychology. Don't talk about your impressions. Talk about specific behavior. We need you to stop this, and we need you to stop that. In fact, we have a video, and Drew will link to that video up here or down there or somewhere on the screen, where we talk about how to use what we call a direct communication or an OIC model. And that's a pretty big deal. And the concept is very simple. You talk with the person about what you've observed, that's the O. Then you talk with them about the impact that their behavior has on the team. And then you clarify your expectations about what's next. That's the OIC. Observe behavior, impact on the team, clarified expectations about what's next. That's a pretty cool way to actually communicate with somebody. Here's the 6th thing you do. At the end of your performance management conversation, ask them a question, what's next? Okay, now that we've talked about this, what are you going to do? Pay really close attention to this, because what they do right after that conversation is going to tell you whether or not they took it to heart. If they say, well, I'm going to think about this for a while, they didn't take it to heart. If they say, I'm going to change this right here and right now, and within the next 2 hours or the next day, they're going to do something different about it, well, then they took it to heart. All right? Here's the 7th thing you do in order to address poor performance. Schedule a follow-up. However quickly you want that performance to change, well, that's about how long you want to wait for your follow-up. If you want to give them a week to change their performance, then schedule a follow-up meeting. Pull out your calendar and schedule a follow-up meeting for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending upon how long you want to give them to change their performance. Short times is better than long times. Okay, a couple pro tips. Well, more than a couple pro tips. Here you go. If you've been around the block a little bit and you want to really get some traction on this, here are some pro tips. Number 1, pay attention to what they do right after that conversation. Number 2, separate words, their words, from actions, their actions. Because many people under that kind of pressure and that kind of situation will say all kinds of really good things. Doesn't matter. What matters is what they do. Number 3, separate excuses from reasons. That's where you want to get super curious. A reason is I was late by half an hour because the freeway was closed because of some wildfires that closed the freeway down. That is a reason. An excuse is the winds of weirdness hit me. I was late a half an hour this day and for this reason, but the day before for another reason, the day before for another reason, the day before for another reason. Those are excuses, all right? A reason is something that truly they couldn't do anything about, and it's rather random in it, okay? Another reason might be, well, that other supervisor told me I can't do it, so that's why I'm not doing it. Okay, that's a reason. An excuse is no one told me. Nobody told me. Poor me. That's an excuse, okay? All right, here's number 4, pro tip. Manage your emotions. If you find yourself getting angry at a team member because they're not performing well, that's your problem. You did not manage your emotions very well. Number 5, here's your 5th pro tip. Remember this, happiness is the result of achievement. It is not a prerequisite to achievement. You are not, as a leader, responsible for your team's happiness. You're responsible for setting the goals, helping them to achieve those results, and happiness will bubble up naturally. My team is just not happy. Well, why not? It's because they're not achieving results. It's not because you didn't give them the right bourbon to drink, right? Okay, here's the 6th pro tip. Catch them doing it right. After you've had a performance management conversation with her and she's going to try to step up, catch her doing it right, okay? That's a lot in just a few minutes. I hope that sticks with you. Because some of the best outcomes you will ever experience will occur when you respect the team and you respect the individual enough to address poor performance. Don't let it slide. It's incredibly expensive when you do. And you remember, leadership is hard. But if you don't address poor performance, you're making it a lot harder than it needs to be. Ha! All right, there's some fun. Let's get back to work. Take care.